Good day, people of around the world and Paris. My name is Benjamin Buzali, and I am very grateful to be here today so I can have the opportunity to present what I appreciate the most, which is my work in the psychological practice and research with severe personality disorders. I would like to add that I am very happy to present my work in the country that was residence to psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, one of the most interesting authors to read. From Freud to the present day, psychoanalysis has been in charge of what is unknown to the subject, what consciousness represses or splits, and how that content repressed by the ego, the consciousness, somehow returns to our daily life. Freud referred to this like a kind of expelled and unwanted citizen from a walled city, and that citizen is constantly looking for his return to the interior of the city. Under the Lacanian line of thought, language limits us, and there is also something that always escapes from the message that was given to someone. All these messages signify and generate an affective experience and object representations. Envy, for me, has always been of great interest in the psychoanalytic field and clinical research. Envy being a subjective position of being in the absence of something, and desire where it is absent, in the self and located in the other. This absence, in such an extent, allows our personality we know as the ego to destroy the relationship with the other, projecting and internalizing aggressive affects, activating primitive and unconscious experiences towards specific individuals and particular situations. This research led me to recognize that it is not envy itself that starts from a specific position with an object, but is generated by a subjective vacuum that is the void itself which generates envy in the relationship with objects. This envy, I argue, comes from a mirror function when relating the self and other, and of course with an emphasis on the importance of the affective experience in relation with the self as proposed by psychoanalyst Otto Kernberg. Human emotional emptiness is characteristic by subjects within a borderline personality organization. Patients within this organization are characterized by poor frustration tolerance, impulsiveness, and as a central defense mechanism, splitting, escisión in Spanish, replacing repression proposed by Dr. Freud. Otto Kernberg proposes a subjective void, a void in borderline patients as an affective state of anxiety in relation with the cleavage with self and objects, with this splitting, escisión. I find Kernberg's description of this subjective void satisfactory, but not close to conclusion. There is a small depth of this void when it comes to the other and language. On the other hand, Massimo Recalcati, as an author that seems to follow Jacques Lacan line of thought, a Lacanian psychoanalyst, talks about a void that seems to me more complex and dense than Dr. Kernberg's subjective void. My theoretical framework is based on a qualitative research method of observation focusing on meaning-making, Babi 2014. This often occurs through case study, personal experience, introspection, life story, interview, artifacts, and cultural texts and productions, along with observational, historical, interactional, and visual texts. This type of research answers questions related to why or how a certain phenomenon may occur rather than how often it occurs. As a foundation, from a theoretical practical methodology, I make use of Freudian psychoanalysis and Otto Kernberg's theory of object relations and neurobiology. Other psychoanalytic authors found in my work are Melanie Klein, Jacques Lacan, Jacques Miller, Slavoj Žižek, Massimo Recalcati, and Carl Gustav Jung. Some approaches of my work goes through the subjects of interest in evolutionary psychology, contemporary ego psychology, and also attachment theory. I am supervised by my master, Dr. Cesar Alfonso Luna, and I was working collaboratively during my stay at the clinic with psychoanalyst Adalberto Levi and Dr. Christian Octavio Bravo, as well as with the psychology department supervisor Valeria Covarrubias. This research was carried out in a field investigation with a deductive methodology. In the investigation, I highlight the main characteristics of envy within eating disorders and how it can trigger an eating disorder in patients with a borderline personality of organization, as well as the function of envy in the mentioned organization. I also review how my model of envy is manifested in the behavior of the masses, social psychology. In the same way, I am working in proposing a different void from the one that Dr. Kernberg proposes, but at the same time, I apply his theory to my alternate subjective void theoretical proposal. In the first part of the thesis, two clinical cases are presented. Two female patients, Matilda with anorexia nervosa, outgoing and explosive temperament, and in a psychopharmacological treatment. She has borderline personality disorders and predominant histrionic features, along with depression and severe anxiety states. On the other hand, Bianca, Blanche in French, with bulimia nervosa, normal outgoing temperament, and histrionic personality disorder with the predominant dependent traits, presented acute experiences of unconscious guilt from the aggression projected on objects, especially her sister. Object of desire for her unconscious, who identified with her sister as a complete entity, perceiving her as a total, feminine, and integrated object. In both cases, envy and the void I propose were what was behind the relationships of clinical cases. Also, in both cases, identification with the sexual identity was a big factor. The mechanisms which operate within envy are devaluation and idealization of the other, and also of self-representations. In the case of Matilda, she desired many things her sister had. Not only physical things, but also the things that cannot be measured. This desire to have what her sister had, for example, close friends and a good relationship with a boyfriend, led my patient to turn upside down the love relationship she had with her sister to a destructive and aggressive one. She was like a second mother to me, and I destroyed the beautiful relationship we had for wanting nothing, Matilda mentioned in later stages of treatment. In this case, envy presents itself when the object operates as a reflection, a mirror, to show the voids in the subject who envies. Consciously and unconsciously, our unconscious voids, generated by the other and desire, are manifested in our pathological behaviors, precisely like those which derive from envy, in this case, anorexia nervosa. Now, in some bulimia nervosa cases, like Bianca's, envy manifests itself as an unconscious identification with food, love from the other, and her projected affects towards the envied object. The patient cannot differentiate and process, digest, the affective relationships that involve love and food. Food, love and hate are undifferentiated. This undifferentiation is concerning with the envied object, this one being always with a significant other, mother, father, uncle, and so on. Food is the main representative of the first affective relation towards that particular significant other. The rejection of food in bulimia nervosa is not only a rejection of life itself, but also a total dismissal from love. This investigation considers that in borderline patients with bulimia nervosa, internalization and projection processes are altered due to the splitting and the integration of the affective experience. It is difficult for the borderline patient to place the Lacanian real into something symbolic and affectively stable. Instead, they binge and vomit as an acting out. The infiltration of aggression in the internalized self and other representations is key in how the patient approaches their relationship with him, herself, and others. As a conclusion in the investigation, in a neurotic personality organization, envy is projected unconsciously onto the other. It is projected through a position of omnipotence and or vanity, leaving the object in a devalued position. The central characteristic of neurotic envy is to generate frustration in the other, because this is how the neurotic subject feels, due to a self-mediated by repression, and constantly feeling frustrated or burned by a punitive and sadistic superego. In a borderline personality organization, envy is divided, like the self and other representations of borderline patients. This means that the relationship with others is also partial. On the one hand, certain objects are primitively idealized. For example, in an anorexia case, the body, a body part of a friend, an idealized friend. And on the other hand, and simultaneously, certain aspects of that object is devalued. These objects have something the patient wants and consequently opens a subjective void in the subject who envies, in the incomplete subject. In both subjective positions, idealization and devaluation, the other is perceived as complete. In topics related to clinical psychology, we always find our patients mention phrases like the following: I want to find my soulmate, I feel incomplete, I'm looking for my one and only, I feel empty, I'm hungry for her love, and thousands more. Subjectively, we desire, in the psychoanalytic term, and long for what we lost, and consequently, the subjective emptiness is impossible to fill, leaving a permanent subjective void. This is why Freud mentioned that we are repetitive subjects of the unconscious in Review of Psychopathology of Everyday Life in 1915. In some cases of anorexia nervosa, like Matilda's, the absence of the sign of love from the other, in severe cases of anorexia, is one of the main routes, I agree, to awaken this subjective void. The subject with anorexia deposits in its own void the signifier of love. It is constituted in a love for death, where there is nothing. There is an idealization where nothingness is found. In this nothing, nada in Spanish, aggressive affects are in relation to the imaginary perception of the patient towards her body, image, and personality. The second part of the investigation, which started in July 2019, is currently working on the following. In the second part of this investigation, there is an application of the model developed on MB based on object relations theory and clinical psychoanalysis to different psychosocial phenomena. Mainly the Second World War, Hitler psychology, the ecology problem solving logic, and ideology. For example, when we analyze the Second World War, we see how the social self of Nazi Germany identifies with a representation of an imaginary object. In this case, the representation of the Jew. This imaginary symbolic language-derived construction is located in the place of subjective persecution. We see it as an intruder of a paranoid origin. Paranoia, in this case, coming from an imaginary object, giving rise to the subject projecting or repressing his or her aggressive affects towards that specific object. How does the imaginary object of coronavirus has altered your personality? Continuing with the example of the Second World War, we analyze how the imaginary object of the Jew was experienced unconsciously as a complete object. They had something that the Nazis wanted, economically successful, for example. Socially and individually, therefore, as I review throughout this research, the imaginary object of the Jew, linguistically constructed, is linked together with a hollow representation of the social German self. In other words, to whom the social and individual void of some will place its envy and aggression later on. Precisely in this imaginary figure of the Jew, we comply and store aggressive affects which generate social chaos. This imaginary object, an object of ideology, is precisely an object that contains desires which make a whole. The subject covers his emptiness, his void, with the imaginary object of ideology. As a result, we can emphasize in clinical psychology the importance of what we imagine, feel, and symbolically try to communicate when treating severe personality disorders, especially eating disorders. Disorders that always scream a primitive psychological void. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, every person has a subjective void of its own that speaks something about his or her past. This void makes us look for things we lost and won't have in the same way as we experienced them. Metaphorically, the philosopher Alan Watts has indirectly referred to this manifestation of the void as the following. It is like a dog trying to chase its own tail, explaining that this is what happens when self-improving. Having, not having, generates an envious and incomplete subject of the unconscious, a subject immersed in language, with a void that will never be full, and if certain conditions are met, it can lead to severe psychopathology, or, on the other hand, as Freud would say, a psychopathology of everyday life. Thank you very much for your attention. Vive le Mexique, et l'amour et la compassion avant tout. Thank you very much and have a good night.